Minasan, ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, and it's my great honor to welcome you all today to the 4th annual Japan Symposium. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We are tremendously fortunate to have this beautiful UWA campus and to be part of the UWA community. I'd like to pay my respects to the leaders past, present, and emerging of the Noongar people and say how much we've enjoyed our opportunities here. Today is a wonderful continuation of a partnership we've had with the wonderful Japanese Consulate here in Western Australia. I recognize the Japanese Consul General, Suzuki Toru, who's here in a very important part of our community, and with the Japanese Embassy. For the 4th year in a row, the Perth USAsia Centre is delighted to host this symposium, which helps highlight the essential relationship between Australia and Japan. Let me begin by also recognizing some very important guests that we've got in the audience. A member of the Perth USAsia Centre Board of Directors and a distinguished fellow of our centre's former Foreign Minister and former Defence Minister Stephen Smith. If we were smarter and planned well enough and knew that he was going to be in town, we'd have him up on the stage as well. But many of you will know he's now the chair of a newly launched UWA Defence and Security Institute. We also have with us, of course, the ambassador from Japan, Yamagami Shingo, who's the Japanese ambassador to Australia, and his wife, Kaoru, who's joined him here. I know from experience that just over getting close to 8 years ago, when I flew out to interview for the job in Perth, they were smart enough to fly my wife along with me, because when your wife is with you, Perth looks that much more beautiful. So it's a wonderful thing to have that process. We're also joined by Australia's former Premier and Western Australia's former Premier and Australia's former Ambassador to Japan, Richard Court, the former Foreign Minister and former member for Curtin, the Hon Julie Bishop, who's now the Chancellor of the Australian National University. And I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Bill Townsend, who's with INPEX. INPEX, as you know, is one of the important corporate partners of the Perth USAsia Centre, and for the last several years, a very important part of this symposium, actually since the very inception of it. I'd also like to recognize Sarah Hooper, who's the representative of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Western Australia. We call her the ambassador to Australia, as it works out very well. And of course, U.S. Consul General David Gaynor. I could keep going on. It's a wonderful and supportive community that we have here in the room. I would also acknowledge that this event and these proceedings are being broadcast simultaneously, so a special welcome to those who are watching us online to participate in our events today. I have realized that thanks to COVID, or probably no thanks to COVID, that last year was the first year since 1995 that I was unable to travel to Japan. And that has left kind of a Japan-sized hole in my stomach in terms of the wonderful food I enjoy there, but more importantly, in my understanding of the regions. And the good news is that during the last year and a half, Japan has not been idle by any means. I think many of you will have known that over a rather difficult stretch in politics in my homeland, the United States, Japan played a very important role, together with Australia, in regional leadership. The miraculous recitation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the form of the Comprehensive and Trans-Pacific Partnership, working very closely with Australia in that front, and candidly holding the door open for what we hope will be a rapid return by the United States and growth from others. Just the weekend before last, there was a historic leaders meeting of the Quadrilateral Strategic Dialogue, what is known as the Quad. So the Prime Minister of Japan, of Australia, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of India, not only met together virtually, but put together a joint statement with an attachment and a joint op-ed in the Washington Post. And anybody who's worked in government, and I see quite a few of you in the audience, will realize what an accomplishment that was to do so early in an administration and to be so forward-leaning. And it really speaks well to the importance, not just of Japan to Australia. A couple days ago was out in the beautiful Japanese gardens right behind our offices in the arts faculty there, realized that those gardens were built in 1976, were donated by the Tokyo Foundation. So Japan has long had an important role here in Western Australia, but it's not just important to us. It's an important partner with us in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. So we couldn't be more delighted today to be hosting the 4th Annual Japan Symposium. To formally kick off the events, today it's my great honor to turn the podium over to our former Western Australian Premier and Australia's former Ambassador to Japan, Richard Court. So Richard.
Thank you, Gordon, to Ambassador and his lovely wife, Karu-san, to the Consul General, to Julie Bishop, to Stephen Smith, our former Foreign Minister, and to Sarah Hooper, representing DFAT, friends all. Look, it's been a pretty tough week for me. My political party got a thrashing. But just as bad, this week I keep getting all these photos from my former colleagues in the embassy in Tokyo, sending through these amazing photos of cherry blossoms, and they're in full bloom at present. And a bit like you, Gordon, I feel like jumping on a plane if I could to get up there. Look, it's my pleasure to introduce our two keynote speakers to this Japan 2021 Securing an Open Rules-Based Indo-Pacific Economic Region Symposium. In introducing first the Ambassador, His Excellency Ambassador Yamagami Shingo, I'd like to say that one of the greatest honours you can receive when visiting another country is to be invited to someone's home. The Ambassador and his charming wife, Karu-san, invited me to their beautiful home in one of the most stunning mountainside locations in Karuizawa. When I arrived and I walked up to their front door, I noticed a new black Panasonic electric bike of a particular model, very fast, very state-of-the-art bike. Just 2 weeks previously, I had purchased the exact same bike in the same colour in Tokyo. So, Ambassador, that is just further proof as to how like-minded our two countries have become. But seriously, I'm often asked, what was the greatest highlight of your 4 years in Japan as the ambassador? And I say that it was experiencing the incredible trust and respect that has grown between our two countries. It's just amazing. It's a wonderful story that our two countries can be so proud of. You know, having come from fighting a bitter war in World War II to working together so closely, particularly, as Gordon said, in recent years with trade negotiations and negotiating defence treaties and bringing other like-minded countries together in our region. The work on the Quad has just been fabulous. And Ambassador, you are continuing the work to build this trust and respect between our two countries, and we really appreciate it. The Ambassador has extensive experience in the US, UK, United Nations, dealing with China, and is certainly very well connected inside the Japanese system. So, Ambassador, to you and your wife, welcome to Australia, welcome to Western Australia, and you've probably learnt in the few days that you've been here that this state is the powerhouse of the Australian economy, and politically it is different, at present very different. Now I'll introduce Julie at the same time. I mean, what an amazing career Julie has had. For many people in the legal profession, becoming the managing partner of a leading legal practice would be your career pinnacle, but not with Julie. She wanted to provide public service as a politician. And we all know the challenges of women breaking into this political world, trying to gain selection in winnable seats. Well, Julie didn't just talk about it or complain. She went straight for the jugular, so to speak. She ran against the Prime Minister's preferred candidate in a seat, and she won that seat. Now, running against the Prime Minister's preferred candidate puts you in the sin bin for a few years, and but with sheer persistence and performance, she could not be overlooked. She went into the ministry, and she went on to become the deputy leader of the party for over a decade, and she was an outstanding foreign minister for many years. Julie, it was just wonderful when you visited Japan when I was there. And I remember on one particular occasion, it was a 2+2 foreign ministers and defence meeting. There were a number of them. But at that particular meeting, there were 3 female ministers and 1 male minister. There was Maurice Payne was the defence minister, you were the foreign minister, Inada-san was the Japanese defence minister, and Kishida-san was a lone male in that meeting. But it was a wonderful experience. Post-politics, Julie has taken on the role of being Chancellor of ANU, a very important role, a very important university. She's the first woman to be appointed into this position, along with many other roles in the private sector. So these 2 highly experienced speakers will keep us very current today, which is important because of the incredible change that is occurring across the Indo-Pacific region. So, Ambassador, I would like to invite you to give the keynote address. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words, Richard, and also Gordon. And I'm just arrived right after Christmas at Australia, so you may call me a new kid in the outback. But Honourable Miss Julie Bishop, the Honourable Mr. Stephen Smith, the Honourable Mr. Richard Court, Professor Gordon Flake, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional lands of Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. It is a great pleasure to be here in Perth for the first time. In some ways, it feels more like Japan than Canberra. The lobsters are amazing, and the time difference is much shorter. There are some similarities between Perth and Canberra, however. Perth is famous for the perpetually smiling quokka. In Canberra, too, we have perpetually smiling mamas, but we call them diplomats. Although, as you may have noticed, some countries also assign wolves. This symposium has covered a range of timely issues which the global community faces amidst an increasingly complex Indo-Pacific and the economic damage of a global pandemic. Today, I would like to contribute to these discussions by outlining how the way forward for Japan and Australia has been and continues to be driven by our shared values and strategic interests. One of the longest standing of these is our shared commitment to a rules-based trading system. Japan and Australia's trade relationship extends as far back as the 19th century. Records show that coal was shipped from Australia to Japan as early as 1865. Over 6 decades ago, that trade relationship was given a framework through the signing of our bilateral commerce agreement. During this period, the extraordinary cultivation of Japan-Australia trade relations by the late Sir Charles Court, of course Richard's father, saw the development of large-scale Japanese investment in Western Australia's resource sector. Subsequently, for over 40 years, Japan enjoyed the status of Australia's largest trading partner. Today, exports to Japan account for around 10% or $90 billion of Australia's total trade. But it doesn't stop there. The liberalization of our bilateral trade helped to forge a deep trust between our business leaders, giving them confidence and eagerness to invest. Indeed, Japanese direct investment has more than doubled over the past 12 years. Today, Japan is one of the top sources of foreign investment in Australia, amounting to remarkable $116 billion in total stock value. According to one calculation, over 74,000 jobs have been created here in Australia by Japanese companies, who are also listed as some of the highest corporate taxpayers. These economic benefits are only possible because of our shared commitment to the rules-based trading system. We are willing and ready to protect and enhance that system. Within a few short decades of creating a framework for our trade relationship, our mutual desire to promote free trade led us on another mission. Together, Japan and Australia became the driving force behind the establishment of the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, a forum which allows us to flourish through regional economic integration. On the global stage, our dedication to the rules-based system continues to align us as natural partners. Together, Japan and Australia will work towards the expansion of the CPTPP and the successful implementation of the RCEP. Sorry about too much gobbledygook. As staunch believers in the rules-based multilateral trading system, our nations are working closely towards reform of the WTO, including its dispute settlement mechanism. In bilateral talks last year, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga publicly agreed that, I quote, "Trade should never be used as a tool to apply political pressure," end of quote, which I believe should be our guiding principle in the face of today's challenges. Japan appreciates the contribution of Australian exports towards our prosperity and economic security. Around 60% of all Japan's iron ore imports come from Australia, and the lion's share of that is from this state. 40% of Japan's LNG is sourced from Australia, 1/4 of which is from WA. And of the 17% of Japan's wheat imports which come from Australia, 15% is growing right here. Has anyone here ever bought Japanese udon noodles at the supermarket? You may not have realized, but your state is the main supplier of the high-quality starchy wheat needed for those noodles. So next time you purchase them, you can wish them a warm welcome home. I must also say it is fortuitous that this symposium takes place in Perth. This month has seen a man who fell in love with this city, honored with the most senior appointment of an Australian candidate to an international body for decades. Of course, I'm talking about Matthias Cormann. Japan is delighted to be able to work with incoming Secretary General to the OECD, Mr. Matthias Cormann. His appointment is yet another indication of Australia's growing standing within the international community, a development Japan welcomes and strongly supports. To tell you the truth, I'm beginning to wonder where I too should immigrate to Perth. It seems to be a great starting point for a brilliant career. Though I'm a little worried that in my case, my skill set would only lead me to Rottnest Island. Smiling, smiling, smiling. Japan and Australia also share a dedication to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Our growth into a fully rounded partnership, which includes strategic objectives, has been steady but exponential. 14 years ago, we signed a joint declaration on security cooperation. Since then, our relationship has been elevated to a special strategic partnership and diversified to include cooperation in areas like defense and intelligence. Today, Japan and Australia regularly participate in joint exercise, cooperate on logistics, and hold 2+2 talks between our foreign and defense ministers. I vividly recall the days when former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop played a pivotal role in those discussions. Most recently, our leaders reached in-principle agreement on the Breakthrough Defense Pact during Prime Minister Morrison's visit to Japan last year. On a multilateral scale, Japan and Australia expressed their dedication to stability in the Indo-Pacific through the historic first ever leaders meeting of the Quad just over a week ago. There, they reaffirmed their intention to strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion. As Australia's doorway to the Indo-Pacific, I am sure that you, the people of Western Australia, understand best the importance of working with India to preserve stability in our region, including the Indian Ocean. My experience as a former head of the Intelligence and Analysis Service of Japan's Foreign Ministry has led me to be personally grateful, really grateful to Australia for its security and intelligence cooperation. Whilst I cannot divulge any sensitive information here, but I can assure you that Western Australia's secret to the perfect glass of wine remains safe. Japan and Australia also share a vision for a low-emission future. With a long history of economic complementarity in the resources sector, Japan and Australia are natural partners in the global fight against climate change. Only a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of attending the commencement ceremony of the world's first global hydrogen supply chain project. And I must tell you, the sheer scale of this project is astonishing. Pioneer technology is being used to produce and transport hydrogen all the way from Victoria's Latrobe Valley to Kobe, Japan. Driven by an all-Japanese multi-industry consortium, this project's success will have an enormous impact on both our nations. Energy-consuming industries such as Japan's world-famous automotive industry will be transformed forever when the stable supply of hydrogen fuel becomes commercially available. Likewise, Australia will benefit immensely as it leaps closer to its goal of becoming a global leader in the supply of clean hydrogen energy. The success of this project might also galvanize energy leaders in Western Australia. I look forward to the day with excitement when Western Australia achieves its aim of a similar market share in global hydrogen exports as the share of LNG it exports today. The vast potential of hydrogen could very well lead to the next golden era for the industries of our two nations. I, for one, am excited for what the future holds for us. Like many countries, Japan and Australia also share a strong desire for a prosperous post-pandemic future. Unlike many countries, Japan and Australia have managed to avoid overwhelming our health systems and prolonged nationwide lockdowns. We have been amongst the global frontrunners in managing the health crisis. Now, as vaccines are rolled out in both our nations, we are looking ahead to economic recovery. Throughout the pandemic, Australia and Japan have continued to look to new frontiers of economic cooperation in areas such as critical minerals, infrastructure, and even space. We have not allowed necessary but strict health restrictions to stagnate our cooperation. Did you hear, for instance, about the dazzling blaze of light that streaked across the outback sky last December? Japanese Space Agency, JAXA's Hayabusa 2 capsule landing in South Australia created an opportunity for the people of Japan and Australia to forget about their pandemic woes and look to the stars. Under the volatile circumstances of Adelaide's sudden lockdown, it was only because of the dedication of our two nations that this mission was able to succeed. At the same time, Japan and Australia remain vigilant about the ongoing health risks, particularly to our neighbors. Japan and Australia, along with India and the US, have agreed to work together to distribute 1 billion vaccines to our Asian and Pacific Island neighbors. The vaccine rollouts also signal that resumption of travel is becoming more attainable day by day. Travel between Australia and Japan was central to our relationship before the pandemic, and so it will be afterwards. The appetite of Japanese travelers for Aussie holidays has not waned at all. They are still drawn to the prospect of an adventure in the Down Under out of their love of Aussie food and wine, the natural landscape, and its reputation as a safe destination. Likewise, Australians who visit Japan are an important asset to Japan's tourist market. You might be surprised to hear they spend the largest amount of money per person and have a long average stay of 13 days. So please, all you Aussie travelers, come back to Japan. I know that the snowfields of Hakuba and Niseko are particularly popular, but I do hope that your former Ambassador Richard agrees with me when I say that my hometown of Karuiza also has a lot to offer. Situated deep in the mountains at the foot of a volcano, visitors can enjoy hiking, cycling, onsen, and of course, a bev or two with me at my place. You all know that Richard and I certainly enjoyed more than a few. To conclude, I would like to reiterate that our shared values and strategic interests can and will help us to overcome increasing complexity in the Indo-Pacific and threats to the rules-based order. Our history of seeing eye to eye, working closely together, has created a strong foundation of trust between our two nations. Japan values this trust and considers it the greatest asset to our friendship. I am determined to do my utmost to strengthen our ties, uphold our shared values, and promote our strategic interest. And I do hope that you will join me in this important endeavor. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Good morning, and it is so good to be back here at the Perth USAsia Centre. Now, I live just over the road, but it seems that we're now returning to pre-COVID normalcy. So it's wonderful to be here, and I applaud the role that this centre plays under the wise guidance of Professor Gordon Flake. I acknowledge the excellent speech by Ambassador Yamagami Shingo and the way he detailed the long and productive partnership between Australia and Japan, and of course Western Australia and Japan. And I welcome His Excellency and his wife to Perth and to Rottnest Island. Ambassador, I know people who could arrange a permanent residency visa. You just have to give me the word. I also acknowledge my friend and former Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, who has also held the great honour of representing this country internationally with great distinction. And I pay tribute to my dear friend and political mentor, Richard Court, an outstanding Premier of this great state and an equally outstanding ambassador to Japan. And I know he and his beautiful wife Jo made a significant impact in Tokyo. I witnessed it firsthand. I welcome the team from IMPEX, including Bill and John. They hosted me in a South Korean shipbuilding yard as I was bestowed the honour of being named godmother to the world's largest semi-submersible LNG structure. Bill, I hope my godchild is behaving herself up on the northwest shelf. What a proud moment that was, to have a semi-submersible LNG structure named after you. Now, a particular welcome to the newer member of the IMPEX team, Marianne Bell, who was a former DFAT officer and worked for a time with me in my ministerial office, and to Sarah Hooper, heading up DFAT here in Perth. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we meet, the Olympic torch relay is underway in Fukushima. And doesn't that remind us all of the immense resilience of the Japanese people as they overcame that shocking disaster in Fukushima? And also the contemporary role that Japan is playing as the host of the 2021 Olympics in the most challenging circumstances that one could envisage. But let me turn to the theme of this symposium, and I thank the Japanese Consul General for co-hosting this today. The Australia-Japan relationship is a vital bedrock of Australia's international engagement, economically and strategically. We have a shared commitment to democracy and the rules-based order, and our values so often align. Both our nations rely on an open and fair international trading system underpinned by freedom of navigation and security of sea and air lanes. Our commitment to a world regulated by rules, institutions and norms of behaviour have been demonstrated over many years through our engagement bilaterally and multilaterally. I have a clear recollection of my first meeting as Foreign Minister with then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Tokyo in 2013, and the many meetings thereafter. And I remain gratified at his personal support for the new Colombo Plan. This was a project that I initiated that would support thousands of Australian undergraduates to live and study and work in Japan and many other nations of the Indo-Pacific. And over the 6 or 7 years since the new Colombo Plan was instigated, tens of thousands of students have spent time in our region. But Prime Minister Abe was a particularly staunch supporter of the program. He immediately understood its importance as another bridge between our two great nations that would connect future generations of Australian and Japanese leaders. Indeed, he spoke about it in his speech at the joint sitting of the Australian Parliament during his visit. And I deeply appreciated his enthusiasm and that of my counterpart foreign ministers, Minister Kishida and Minister Taro Kono, and that of the Japanese people as they welcomed so many Australian students to their universities to study and to live, to their business places for internships and work experience for our students, and into their lives. And I know that these networks, these connections, will last many, many years to come. In 2017, I released a foreign policy white paper that was designed to guide Australia internationally for the following 10 years, and it's about 40% through its life, so it's interesting to see how we've fared. That report included a specific reference to Japan, and allow me to quote, "Our partnership with Japan, one of our most important regionally and globally, will remain essential to Australia's interests. The web of US alliances in the Indo-Pacific, especially US alliances with Japan, the Republic of Korea and Australia, makes an essential contribution to the regional security. The Indo-Pacific democracies of Japan, Indonesia, India, and the Republic of Korea are of first-order importance to Australia, both as major bilateral partners in their own right and as countries that will influence the shape of the regional order. We expect Japan, which possesses advanced military forces and significant technological capabilities, steadily to pursue reforms to its defence and strategic policies over the decade. Australia supports these reforms and Japan's efforts to improve its security capabilities and to play a more active role in the security of the region. In recent years, our defence relationship has grown rapidly. Australia will continue to boost defence engagement with Japan, including in maritime security and in research and development." End quote. Well, with all the humility I can muster, I suggest that these observations are arguably more relevant today even than in 2017. For we are at a pivotal moment in the history of modern nations. The world's sole superpower, the United States, is under challenge from a rising power in China. These moments have historical parallels that should inform, although they do not and cannot predict, the outcome of what will be an epic struggle. Other nations have a keen vested interest in how this plays out, including Japan and Australia. My hope is that China will recognise that it has a particular responsibility to uphold the rules-based order, as it is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and this was certainly a point I raised from time to time with my Chinese counterparts. However, we shouldn't underestimate the sense of resentment that is driving much of China's leadership ambitions. There are genuine grievances about the so-called century of humiliation from 1839 to 1949, and that's generally recognised. But China, again understandably, feels that its growing economic weight has not been recognised in some of the global pillar institutions, the IMF, the World Bank and the like. However, I feel that these grievances are being used as an excuse to extend China's claims far beyond such grievances and to engage in territorial expansion that is a direct challenge to the rules-based international order and its dispute resolution mechanisms. China seems to be adopting the stance that defined past eras of might is right, and that is a proven pathway to conflict. There also appears to be a narrative within the Chinese leadership that history is on China's side and that its rise is as inevitable as the decline of the United States. And I think this was reflected in the behaviour of China's leading diplomats at the recent US-China summit in Alaska that rapidly collapsed in acrimony as both sides traded insults and accusations of hypocrisy. For others around the world, this was entirely predictable. Many of us had been subjected to similar treatment in the past. In fact, I felt I could have scripted it. Most importantly, it revealed an attitude that China believes it is now at least the equal of the United States and perhaps dominant. And I think that is an assumption on shaky foundations. I'm often asked whether we're on the cusp of a new Cold War, but that analogy is not valid. The United States was largely insulated from the West and had its own economy with little trade with non-bloc countries, and the people were isolated. In contrast, China is deeply embedded in the global economy and critical to many supply chains, indeed holding a monopoly over some, and the Chinese diaspora is global. Even if one were to entertain a discussion about a revival of Cold War-era policies of containment, it's simply impractical, impossible against China. And that raises the question of what we can do to send the message that some of China's more aggressive behaviour is breaching international norms. I think one of the most important is to build stronger international networks of the kind that the United States had been leading for more than 75 years. For example, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue has been reinvigorated in large part due to China's aggressive conduct on its border with India. India is renowned as a non-aligned partner, yet it has been driven to embrace the Quad in ways that I didn't expect. I'm pleased to note that Japan has played a leading role in that process, due in part, I think, to the strong personal relationship that existed between former Prime Minister Abe and Indian Prime Minister Modi, and the obvious new relationship with the current leadership. The Quad, as it's called, now meeting at leader level, is an important piece of regional diplomatic architecture. No other forum in the region plays a leading role on strategic issues. It began as the four nations came together in response to the Aceh tsunami disaster, and one of its legacies of the recent meeting will be a regional response to the COVID pandemic with the supply of vaccines. Together, Australia and Japan must continue to play a constructive role in multilateralism. We had great hopes for the Obama-led trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as the cornerstone of the US pivot to Asia, and it had massive strategic as well as economic benefits as a gold standard free trade agreement. But it founded on the rocks of the 2016 US presidential election campaign, where not one candidate for the Democratic or Republican primary nomination, let alone the final candidates, supported it publicly, although some supported it privately and most definitely in principle. But Japan and Australia joined forces with others to continue the negotiations for a high-quality agreement without the United States. Many said it couldn't happen, but we succeeded. And it was a lesson that in partnership, we're a pretty formidable team. One of the enduring memories of my time as Foreign Minister was the absolute reliability of Japan to honour its commitments and to support principled positions in international forums. Trust and honour is important when engaging with multilateral institutions, where not all nations are transparent about their intentions. Forming partnerships and groupings of like-minded nations will be crucial in the years ahead. Recently, in fact in the last couple of days, I've been undertaking consultations with former leaders and senior officials of nations of the Indo-Pacific for a research project that I'm undertaking as the 2021 Henry Kissinger Fellow of the John McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University. Had it not been for COVID, I'd be in Arizona right now, or at least Washington. But some consistent themes have emerged from those I have interviewed, and they are former leaders and foreign ministers and senior officials. I won't put the current leadership in such a difficult position, but the consistent themes emerging. China will be an increasingly serious challenge through its economic heft, cyber capabilities, and its increasingly powerful military. The US must get its house in order, politically and economically, in order to maintain an international leadership role and to maintain international respect. Economic factors are more influential than military in the minds of nations of the Indo-Pacific. There's a level of decoupling in the technology space between the United States and China, so there needs to be a concerted effort among Western nations to maintain a technological edge through coordinated research and development, which of course is underway to some extent, to avoid that fracture. And finally, the view is that nations are not comfortable with a world dominated by an authoritarian regime. And nations of the Indo-Pacific are in fact looking for more, not less, US leadership. So as friends of the United States, it is important that the Biden administration hears from us, that it needs to achieve greater bipartisanship in Washington, particularly on foreign policy, and that it needs to address concerns about the US economy, which is making some nations feel rather vulnerable. Rising inequality and debt are undermining US standing as an international leader. Many of the challenges facing the world today have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. However, I see COVID-19 as a short-term disruptor that will be negated by improved treatments and the vaccine cavalry that's on its way. But there were already forces at work driving long-term change. I call them megatrends. The first, of course, is the great power competition between the United States and China, and that's likely to escalate even under a new US administration. A second megatrend is declining support for the post-World War II consensus, the rules-based order, the institutions and conventions and treaties and norms underpinned by international law that's evolved over the past 75 years that seeks to manage the behaviour of states and towards each other. Should that order continue to fray and nations not rally to its defence, we are heading for a zero-sum world that is more confrontational and more prone to conflict. The third is the fourth industrial revolution, the technology revolution. It's impacting our lives in dramatic ways, and haven't we seen how life has changed as a result of COVID? I mean, Zoom, I'd never heard of it. Now it's my best friend. I live in a Zoom room. And yet experts believe that we're only at the start of a much bigger transformation of how we live and work and communicate. The fourth megatrend is climate change that will have implications for food security and water supplies and natural disasters. So in this context, it's more important than ever for leaders and nations to fully understand the consequences of their actions, and particularly the unintended consequences. So nations and their leaders must develop evidence-based policies that can progress our cause as democratic nations committed to freedom and liberty with an optimistic outlook for the future. And that's Australia and Japan. And we'll continue to strengthen our partnership as we have shown over many years that we can have a greater impact for good when acting together. Thank you.
Thank you. What wonderful speeches by the Ambassador and by former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, and thank you so much, Richard Court. At this point, I'd like to ask Ambassador Yamagami and Ambassador Court to join us up on the stand. We are going to be joined by our new colleague from Canberra. Hayley Channer has joined the Perth USAsia Centre at the beginning of this year as a Canberra-based Senior Policy Fellow. And so she's going to help us kind of think through some of the issues that we discussed there in a bit of a panel discussion. So Hayley, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to come up here and stand.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth USAsia Centre. I feel so fortunate to be able to moderate this panel this morning. Each and every person here on this stage is what I would call true foreign policy royalty. And
with one exception. Thank you.
You are as well, Gordon. And obviously, our panel members are already very well known to the people in this room, and they have already been formally introduced. So instead of retelling you their stellar careers, what I thought I might do to introduce them is just to give you a personal insight into each one of our panel members so that you can learn something new about them. So Julie,
we laugh nervously.
Julie, if I may start with you. Julie is a dedicated runner, and even when she was Foreign Minister with a very busy schedule, she still kept to her morning routine of going for a run. And I think you might have run on every single continent except for Antarctica.
That's true. I think I ran every day on every overseas trip I did, unless we were leaving at 4 a.m. But in Tokyo, around the Imperial Palace. Beautiful run.
And Ambassador Yamagami, since moving to Canberra Ambassador Yamagami has very astutely recognised that Canberra has a very strong cycling culture, and he's purchased a bicycle.
Another one.
And on the weekends, you'll be able to find him cycling around Lake Burley Griffin with his mates.
Yes, we wanted to ship this bike, the same model as Richard's bike, all the way from Japan to Australia. But because of the lithium battery, we couldn't do it.
Oh.
So as soon as we arrived at Canberra, we went to this bike shop. We bought brand new two bikes, e-bikes. I think great contribution to the Australian economy.
Well, now that I know that it's an e-bike, I actually feel a little bit better because I could never keep up with Julie running, and I couldn't keep with you biking. But if I had an e-bike and you had a regular bike, it'd be okay. Yes.
And then turning to Richard Court, few people would know that Richard is actually a champion sailor and that he has designed modifications to sailing ships to improve their performance. And also Professor Gordon Flake. Gordon likes to go snorkeling off Perth's beautiful coastline. So we have a very active panel of 4 members up here. Some might even say it's our own mini quad. Now, we have a little over half an hour, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to facilitate a dynamic discussion so that you, the audience, have an opportunity to ask questions of our esteemed panel members. And in fact, we also have an international audience watching us. And what I'd like to do is ask one of the questions that has been sent through. While I'm doing that, I would really encourage everyone in the room to start thinking about what kind of questions that you would like to ask about the very critical Australia-Japan relationship. So the first question that we have here, it comes from Glenn Fukushima from the Centre for American Progress in Washington, DC, and his question relates to the Quad. And Julie and Yamagami-san, the Quad is something that you both talked about in your presentations. Glenn asks, do you believe the Quad should be limited to Australia, Japan, India and the United States, or would it be more effective and influential if it were to include other countries, whether from Asia or Europe? So I might actually ask Gordon, would you like to field that question to begin with, and we'll open it up to the other panel members?
Well, first, welcome to Glenn Fukushima. Those of you who don't know him, he is a long-standing U.S. trade representative, senior official in the United States, served as president and then a governor of the American Chamber of Commerce in Tokyo, and then with Airbus for many, many years. So really one of the great Japan specialists globally. So I appreciate that question. If I'm pedantic, obviously, you cannot expand the Quad without it becoming a Quint, right? so obviously there's nothing beyond that. There already is a lot of discussion about Quad plus activities. In international diplomacy, and obviously our panelists know this far better than me, there's always a trade-off. The most efficient form of diplomacy is bilateral by nature. And then you add benefits by expanding to trilateral, but added difficulties in coordination. Then each step up in that process becomes more and more difficult. Just witness the difficulties we've had with the World Trade Organization. Trying to have a global round is the most challenging possible kind of approach to foreign policy. I think for the time being, if you're looking at the countries within this region that have the capacity, the shared values, the shared vision, the shared commitment to the issues that the Quad is likely to focus on, that is a pretty good mix. It's hard to go beyond that. But having said that, I anticipate whether it's ASEAN, whether it's Korea, whether it's the EU, whether it's Indonesia, that there's going to be a tremendous and growing level of interest in cooperating together with the Quad as a coordinating thing. But again, we have direct practitioners who might have added views to that.
Hayley, I'd also like to acknowledge Glenn. He was a regular visitor to Japan. I think he's quite excited that the administration has changed in the United States. Look, I think the importance of the Quad, a big part of it is our improved working relationship with India. And our leaders are getting on really well, and they have a foreign minister who is very easy to deal with. And I think it's that personal relationship that is improving between our two countries that is important. And then you add to that something Stephen would understand. They're sort of spreading, India's starting to spread its influence a bit across to some of these ASEAN countries and to Indonesia. And I think that's very encouraging, those changes that are developing.
If I may go next, Ambassador. As Stephen and I both know, the trilateral arrangements between Australia, US and Japan were well established. And the difficulty with the Quad in the early days was getting India's commitment to it. And India always took its non-aligned position pretty seriously. And so while the trilateral arrangements were obvious, normal, expected, to have India in such a network was quite unusual, and it was driven to embrace the Quad because of the, not only, but in large part because of the behaviour of China on its border, and so it wanted to be part of the US, Japan, Australia framework. Now, I think that it needs to be an embedded piece of diplomatic architecture before we get too excited about adding new members. And yet I agree with Gordon that there is great potential for there to be Quad Plus in the short term. The nations of, I mean, ASEAN is always tricky because even though its mandate sets out that it embraces democracy and freedom and the like, it's a consensus-based organisation. So when the coup occurs in Myanmar, you don't hear a word from any of the ASEAN nations. They believe it in absolute non-interference. And in that sense, the message from China, like, we can guarantee we do not interfere in your domestic affairs, is actually quite well received by some nations. Whereas the Quad, with the United States at its core, sends a far more complex message to the nations of ASEAN. So while I see it has potential, I'd like to see it more embedded as a permanent piece of diplomatic architecture in our region.
Ambassador Yamagami?
Well, let me put it this way. Quad is not an institution. Quad is not an alliance directed at any third party. Rather, Quad is a sort of tools to realize this great concept of free and open in the Pacific. By free and open, we are talking about specifically freedom of navigation, trade, investment, liberalization, rule of law prevailing. Those are important concepts which can be shared by many, many others. So this is like public good, and every country can benefit from it if he or she agrees with this concept. My way of looking at Quad is that way. But right now, I think we are in a very, very critical juncture. For the first time in history, Quad came up with this specific and tangible result in the form of vaccination, climate change, and important emerging technologies. So now is the time for us to concentrate on those specific tangible results.
I know the ambassador's been terribly diplomatic, saying it's not directed at any other country, and of course that's absolutely correct. However, let me just say that for those who see something negative in Quad, should remember that there are many alliances around the world that form when interests align. I always remind people of BRICS, when Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa decided that as major developing economies, they needed to meet on a regular basis to discuss shared interests and the like. Not a peep out of me over that. Thought it was a great idea. So, you don't always have to jump at shadows when you see an emerging framework meeting of like-minded nations.
Can I add a very important distinction? The Quad had largely begun as a senior levels meeting. It grew out of the response to the 2004 Indian Ocean Boxing Day tsunami, and it had various iterations. But it wasn't until last October that there was the first foreign ministers level meeting, and that took place in Tokyo, hosted by your foreign minister, and just weeks before the US presidential election. So in that environment, a little bit controversial, the fact that India and Australia and Japan, and I've always said, in this COVID era, you can measure the importance of an initiative by the willingness of our ministers to come back and do 2 weeks of quarantine for the meeting. So the fact that we went and participated in that forum, at the time I said it had far more to do with Chinese overreach than American outreach. If you look at what happened just 2 weeks ago, however, I would actually think that that shows at a leader's level something beyond that. That's much more about joint outreach. So the agenda that Ambassador Yamagami mentioned of vaccine, both production and distribution, of technology, of climate change, indicates that, while it may be in response to some developments, it also has a proactive agenda, which is very welcome. So thank you for that.
Now, what I'd like to do is open the panel up to questions from the audience. And what I would just mention briefly is, obviously, we've had a lot of news out of Canberra recently. There's a lot happening in Parliament House. What I would ask is that you please respect the time that our esteemed panel members have given to direct your questions to the Australia-Japan relationship. So with that, I'd invite people to just raise a hand, and we do have some roving microphones. And please stand and provide your name and affiliation, and keep your questions short and sharp so that we can get through as many as possible. Sir, did you have a question? Could we get a microphone, please, over here? Thank you.
Thank you. James Trevelyan, University of Western Australia. I'm actually an engineer. Ambassador Yamagami, you spoke at length about the importance of free and open trade. And clearly there are pressures building in the region. I wonder if you could comment perhaps on domestic pressures that are facing major actors, for example, in Japan, in China, maybe Korea too, that are helping to shape foreign policy of these important actors. We don't hear much about that in Australia. We're very familiar with our own domestic political scene, but perhaps if you could enlighten us on what's happening in the domestic spaces of these countries that are shaping this foreign policy discussion. Thank you.
Can I?
Please.
Well, I'm not quite sure this is a direct answer to your question, but let me put it this way. I mean, when it comes to Aussie-Japan relationship, I can say increasing number of Japanese public have full awareness of the importance of our bilateral relationship. So somebody said, this could be, initiated by politicians. I don't think so. It has a strong, broad support, not only from the ruling party, but also from the opposition parties, journalism, academia, and ordinary people in the streets of Tokyo. So I think when it comes to importance of Australia to Japan, more importantly, we do have so favorable opinions of Australia. They love Australia. But at the same time, we have to be careful. We should not take each other for granted. In my presentation, I said Japan in the past was #1 trading partner of Australia for the 40 years. But in these recent years, some Japanese felt a bit lonely. But because some Australians are looking at some other countries. But now is a high time for us to reactivate our bilateral relationship.
Yeah, I think even though the last 4 years with a Trump presidency, Australia and Japan must have been looking over the Pacific even more longingly at one another. Ambassador Court, you spent a long time in Japan. Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, could I just comment from another perspective? The Japan itself, with an ageing, declining population, there's not a lot of sort of growth in their domestic economy for that reason. They have had an incredibly vibrant tourism industry. In recent years, before the pandemic, it was growing to the point where they had nearly 30 million visitors coming to their country, half of them from Korea and China, and if you added Hong Kong and Taiwan, it was about 80% coming from that part of the world. But the way I like describing Japan is it has a domestic economy, but they have been incredibly astute investors globally. So they are heavily invested, their companies, their corporations, across China, across Asia, Europe, the Americas, Africa, Australia. And so this international investment that they have is providing a wonderful dividend stream back to them to enable Japan to maintain very high living standards. And they might have very high internal debt, but they have the ability to pay for that, largely supported by dividend streams and the like that come in. So one of the lessons, Ambassador, that I think is important is that Japanese companies, with the support of their government, have been incredibly patient in the countries they go into. Stephen, you've seen it in Indonesia. A company like Toyota is incredibly large in Indonesia, not just cars, but in different parts of the logistics chain. You go to India, 50% of all cars sold in India are Suzuki, and incredible domination in that particular market. So I think that I like, it's a very good question, because I think Japanese corporates have a very good understanding of what's happening in a lot of other countries.
Mm-hmm. Julie or Gordon, would you like to weigh in on this one, or should we take another question? Can we get more questions, please, from the audience? Yes, right up the back.
Hi, Natalie Samby, a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution and Executive Director of Verve Research. In between Australia and Japan, of course, lies Southeast Asia. And for the last number of consecutive years, the rating of democracy within the region, according to Freedom House, has dropped. In Indonesia, it's dropped 4 points under President Jokowi's tenure. Of what concern is this to the Australia-Japan relationship? And what priorities should Canberra and Tokyo have in terms of raising the level of democracy or strengthening democracy within Southeast Asia, if indeed Australia and Japan are like-minded on that matter?
Great question. Is there any interest in answering that one?
Sure. There's a very interesting report, the Southeast Asia report that's online. In fact, I'll send a link to you. I can't quite remember it, but it also indicated that support for democracy was declining in some nations of Southeast Asia. I think that the challenge for liberal democracies like Australia and Japan and the United States is to show that ours is the preferred model, and one has to do that by example. And that's why I alluded to the fact that the recent upheaval in the United States has been damaging for its image as a robust democratic leader in our region. And of course there are other models, the authoritarian model exemplified by China. In the past, developing nations would find their way to developed status by going down the democratic path. Let's take the Republic of Korea as an example. But there are challenges to adopt another model. And so I think that Australia and Japan and others have to be exemplary examples of how openness and freedom and liberty leads to peace, stability and security. And it's a challenge for all of us. I had a wonderful conversation with a former Foreign Minister of Indonesia recently, and well known to you, Stephen, and he likewise commented that Indonesia is still a fledgling democracy, but they know that it's worth the challenge, that the outcome will ultimately be worth the challenge of staying on that democratic path. But there are other smaller developing nations who perhaps are now moving away from the orbit because of a decline in US leadership in our part of the world. I think under the Biden administration we will see, and people like Kurt Campbell being appointed to roles within the Biden administration, I think we will see that refocus. To be fair, previous US administrations have been caught up in all sorts of other issues around the world, Middle East and counterterrorism and the like. But I think that we have great expectations to see the US, Australia, Japan, India, other democracies leading by example.
Can I?
Of course, Ambassador.
I think when we talk about this issue of democracy in Asia, I would like to point out two important things here. One, we need to be patient. Quite often some in the West seek democracy in an instant manner,
It's not like that. If we take a long-term viewpoint, it's been progressing. So South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, I think democracy is on increase. That's for sure. So we can be patient. We have to take a long-term viewpoint. At the same time, the second point is, we shouldn't take the attitude of condescension or lecturing or preaching. Yes, it is important. Australia and Japan do share universal basic values, including democracy, respect for human rights, the rule of law. That's important. But that said, can we get everybody in Asia on board? For that, we need some time, and each country has its own situation. So we have to be, long-term, we have to be patient, and we have to be considerate. That is what makes Japan and Australia different from a regional hegemon.
Can I add something? Among Ambassador Yamagami's remarks, something I wrote down, he talked about the strong foundation of trust between Australia and Japan, and noted that Japan considered that strong foundation of trust to be among the greatest of assets to our friendship. And if you think about it, what is that foundation of trust based on? It's not based just on a commercial relationship or a fondness for udon noodles that came from our wheat, right? It really is in a faith in those democratic institutions. And so it matters. It really matters in terms of how governments see each other and work together. In this regard, I have to say, while India, the United States, Japan, Australia, none of us are perfect democracies. We've all got our own individual challenges at different times. We're struggling. As a whole, the Quad initiative is very encouraging just because of what it portends. And I would highlight one other thing, just because my colleague Hayley is working on this. One of the things that you did as foreign minister was to launch this regional infrastructure collaboration initiative between Australia, Japan, and the United States. And it becomes really, really important. And I know Hayley's working on a report on that very issue because, as you mentioned, we've got to make the case. We don't have to necessarily preach or look down. But in a world where Japanese investment in infrastructure has far exceeded Chinese investment in infrastructure all throughout Southeast Asia, nobody knows about it, right? And nobody's heard of the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, but everybody's heard of Belt Road Initiative. If you look at overall private sector investment, that coming out of the United States is way ahead, right? And when you combine our three countries and add India too, it's even more miles ahead. And yet we haven't done a very good job of letting the world know that there are alternatives that are out there. And so that notion that, candidly, we have the Japanese flag up here. In a previous symposium, one of the conclusions we came to is that Japan had perhaps learned too well the lessons of the 1980s and the 1990s in the Japan bashing area. And so Japanese corporations tend to be very low-key, very effective at working together, local community, but are not high profile. And so the average person doesn't realize, I'm not sure how many people in Western Australia realize that INPEX is a Japanese corporation. And it has one of the most impressive investments in global history, including your goddaughter. And yet, I think
she's beautiful.
There is an effort to that we need to be much more proactive at letting the region know, particularly Southeast Asia, about what the alternatives are and what is being done by democracies in that region. So.
Actually, there's a great deal of misunderstanding about the financial and investment relationships between various countries. I mean, we all know that China's our largest trading partner by a long way, but not so many know that the US is by far our largest foreign direct investor, by far. So, if you count the US trade relationship and the investment relationship, it's a larger economic partner. But for some reason, we don't seem to focus on that. And likewise, our relationship with Japan.
And also, one more thing, please do not forget the presence of Japanese community here in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
This number is more than 100,000. This is the third largest Japanese community all over the world, only next to United States and China. And in a few years' time, the tendency is this number will surpass the number of Japanese nationals in China. This shows what kind of confidence, trust many Japanese have in this country of Australia.
So when you moved to Western Australia, you're 100,002.
Yes.
I think we've got time for about one or two only more questions. I think Stephen Smith here had a question for our panel.
Thanks very much. Ambassador Julie, thank you very much for your contributions today. And Richard, so much content. I'll indulge myself with a follow-up on Indonesia and then a separate question. I think the Ambassador's comment about strategic patience is absolutely right, which echoes Richard's comment about Japan's economic patience. It was only when SBY was elected twice that we saw a first Indonesian president elected 2 times in a row, and the first time we saw a peaceful transition democratically from one president to another was with Joko. And so we do need to be patient with Indonesia's democracy. But if you were to add in another country to the Quad to make it a quint, and I agree with the notion, let's not do it now, it would be Indonesia. Because the Quad itself is not the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific recognises the rise of India, but also the rise of Indonesia. But in a changing world, a much more aggressive and assertive China, rise of India, rise of Indonesia, there's not one solution. But I think Julie put her finger on a very successful mechanism, which is a trilateral. Japan has a much underrated relationship with Indonesia. There's a lot that we could do with the Japan, Australia, Indonesia trilateral. There's an emerging trilateral there. But if we raise that to the same level over time as the Australia, US, Japan trilateral, where leaders meet, foreign ministers meet and defence ministers meet, then we could do a lot to engage Indonesia. Because when you look at the sweep of the Indo-Pacific, Indonesia in very many respects, in tough times, becomes a crucial swing vote. So engagement of Indonesia, I think, is essential. As there's not one solution, indulge with a sort of a second question or comment. We now have the perversity in our part of the world where the United States is not part of the TPP or the CTPP, and India is not a part of RCEP. What can Australia and Japan do together to ensure that India becomes a part of RCEP and the United States becomes a part of the TPP?
Can I, Ambassador, please?
Well, thank you for asking, very, very excellent question. First, about Indonesia, I will give you one anecdote. Today we have, representative from INPEX. INPEX has a different name in the past. It was called Indonesia Petroleum. That shows how much stake, we had in our relationship with Indonesia. So I fully agree with the importance of, bringing Indonesia, on board. It is the most populous country in Southeast Asia, and quite often the prowess of Indonesia has been underrated. Maybe like Australia, Japan, Indonesia are countries of understatement. So I fully agree with bringing Indonesia into our loop. And when it comes to expansion of TPP, now is the time for us to talk about British entry, and probably Thailand comes next, and Taiwan. But yes, we continue to keep this dream of bringing back Americans into this table of brotherhood. And when it comes to India, it will take time. Australia and Japan worked very, very hard behind the scene to keep India on board when it comes to RCEP. But because of their domestic, situation and economic, affairs, I think it will take a bit of time. But we should never give up on the idea. And I fully agree with when it comes to expanding CPTPP, when it comes to bringing Indians on board to RCEP, I think there is a lot Australia and Japan can do together.
You know what would be really exciting if you got India and the US into TPP and India and the US into RCEP. Now you're talking about a significant regional free trade agreement if the two could overlap. I mean, they're not aligned in terms of the standards and quality, if I might say, but wouldn't that be exciting?
Oh, yes.
Can I just note, just to put this in context, there has been for 30 years a vision of a free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific. And these are two different pathways to that same end, whether it was the TPP, which is a gold standard free trade agreement with all those typical behind the border type of requirements, and a much more grassroots, bottom up led harmonization initiative, which is RCEP. But they're not competing really at all. They're just different pathways to the same goal. I would just thank Japan and thank the leaders in Canberra and Australia for the tremendous effort they've done to keep the door open to the United States TPP. And I think the message that Japan and Australia ought to be sending to Washington with every communication we have is that unless the United States returns to TPP, its rhetoric rings hollow. To use a cattleman's term from my home state of Arizona or Texas or Western Australia, it's all hat and no cattle, right? You can't talk about being economically engaged in the region if you're not part of the preeminent free trade agreement pathway. And so that's clearly not going to happen in the short run, given everything that's on the plate of the U.S. administration with COVID. But I would hope that by the end of the year, early next year, there's serious efforts to get the U.S. in.
And just picking up on Stephen's point, while we're sending WhatsApp messages to our friends in the Biden administration, we should also say, send someone senior to visit Indonesia as soon as possible, because otherwise they'll feel overlooked. It will also send a message to the other ASEAN nations, but I think it's absolutely vital. I remember Secretary of State Clinton made a very early visit to Indonesia and it had a profound impact on the region. So it would be important for the Biden administration, in case anybody's texting the president in the next few days, it would be a really good idea for them to have a high-level visit to Indonesia as soon as possible.
Now we'll take one final question because we have already gone over time, and then I'll ask our last roundup question, please.
Thank you. Bonnie Lin, I'm a Taiwanese-American investor from Silicon Valley. So what are the economic opportunities then? Because crisis does create those opportunities. To double down, we're seeing increased global market volatility combined with increased liquidity. That presents an opportunity for us to double down on investment. So what are the technology, talent, and infrastructure Japan and Australia should be doubling down on?
Question about technology, yes, Ambassador.
I think here important thing is there is no denying that keeping and maintaining this traditional complementary trade relationship. So oil and LNG, coal continue to, or iron ore continue to play an important role in our bilateral trade. That said, as I touched on in my presentation today, there are some new areas emerging. So it's high time for us to enlarge the horizon, including hydrogen or investment in infrastructure or space cooperation and so on. Look, in Western Sydney, consortium of Japanese corporations are now heavily investing in the development of infrastructure over there, and hydrogen, space cooperation. I gave you some examples. So these are new golden opportunities, and I think Australia is up in the mind of Japan because, for two reasons. First, you stand out because of the way you handled COVID-19, and secondly, the way you dealt with pressure from Japan's continental neighbor. So many Japanese do marvel at this consistent, steadfast, resilient posture taken by a number of Aussie friends.
We have run out of time, so what I might just say to close is people may or may not realise that this month marks 10 years since the horrific triple disaster in Japan. And one of my proudest and most fondest moments in the Australia-Japan relationship is the image of Australian Air Force C-17s landing in Japan and assisting with that relief effort. And just to bring Richard Court back into the conversation, Richard, don't mean to put you on the spot, but is there a particular memory that you have or an instance or example of the Australia-Japan relationship that is your fondest, and what does that say about the broader relationship?
First of all, in relation to Fukushima, Julia Gillard is very highly respected in Japan because she was the first international leader to visit and to actually go to the site where the problems were, and they really appreciated that, and they really appreciated the first responders who came from Australia. So it was no surprise when we had the big bushfires last year, particularly on the east coast, the Japanese Self-Defence Force immediately came down with planes, people, and played a constructive role. Yeah, look, two things come to mind. The first one is when the cruise ship Diamond Princess went into quarantine in Yokohama in February at the beginning of that COVID year. I was really impressed with the way in which the DFAT staff working in the embassy were prepared to work pretty much 24/7. We were the contact between nearly 300 Australians, elderly Australians on that ship, and initially getting medications, etc. And then when the ship was evacuated because it wasn't working as a quarantine, we had terrific cooperation from the Japanese Self-Defence Forces in that whole process. So it was just wonderful to see our two countries working together so effectively. And the other highlight was at the peak of COVID, our two countries kept critical negotiations going at a face-to-face level. You mentioned the foreign ministers coming into Japan, knowing that our foreign minister our ministers had to do 2 weeks quarantine. But our Prime Minister went to Japan, and at a very critical time in an important treaty negotiation, he realised that unless it was face-to-face, we weren't going to get this breakthrough. So the Zoom world works to a certain extent, and we've been able to get by for the first year, but we will have to get back to rebuilding our personal relationships in the diplomacy world, in the corporate world, sort of in this post-pandemic period.
It's a fantastic relationship and hopefully only going to get stronger. Can the audience please join me in thanking our wonderful panel this morning?
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
So allow me to close today's proceedings by thanking Hayley for a wonderful panel. We also had 2 closed-door sessions last week and this week on the broader topic of preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific economic era and the supply chains they're in. So we'll be putting out a report on that soon. We look forward to engaging with you. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.